The president imposed a greater cost on Vladimir Putin the day before this shoot-down took place. And what we are doing now is trying to bring our European counterparts along, because we have 4% of Russia's trade is with the United States. 50% of their engagement is with Europe. So we are trying to encourage our European friends to realize this is a wake-up call. And hopefully they will also join us in these tougher sanctions.
So Secretary of State John Kerry responding to a question from Chris Wallace on why President Obama will not get tougher on Vladimir Putin, despite calling the downing of Flight 17 a, quote, outrage of unspeakable proportions. Carl Rove, senior former advisor, deputy chief of staff to President George Bush, and also a Fox News contributor here to analyze this. Carl, how are you? And good morning to you there in Austin, Texas. I guess we're waiting on the Europeans, or the Europeans are waiting for us to drag them along, or it kind of goes hand in hand. The question is, what now? And what next?
Well, look, he's being a little bit disingenuous, because while we have a small amount of trade with the Russians and the Europeans have a lot, nonetheless, the Russians need access to American capital markets. So the tougher our sanctions are, the more likely they are to bring along the Europeans. The other part of this equation is that it's not just about sanctions, it's about aiding the Ukrainians. If the United States were now to say, if President Obama were to call Putin and say, you know what, this is irresponsible on your part and unacceptable, and as a result, we've sent a U.S. or maybe even a U.S. NATO mission to Kiev, and we're going to sit down with the Ukrainians and find out what they need in the way of military supplies and logistics and support for their operations. There's going to be a price to pay for you having done this, and that price is that we're going to make certain they've got what they need in order to reestablish control over the eastern part of Ukraine. That would be tough. Both of those things would be tough. Tougher sanctions on the Russian economic sectors, particularly energy and banking, so they didn't have access to U.S. capital markets. That would bring the Europeans along, and then aid the Ukrainians in doing what they need to do to reestablish control of the Kiev government.
So do you anticipate the administration doing that and taking those steps?
You know, if the president and his people call this unspeakable, and if the Secretary of State goes out and says the Russians are responsible for it, then they'd better act, because once again the credibility of the United States is at stake, and they've not got a good record on this. Syria saying Assad must go, and then he's not gone, saying we need a status of forces agreement to leave behind a force in Iraq, and it doesn't come to pass. I mean, all these things have tended to undermine the credibility of the United States, and Putin is a guy who senses weakness and seizes upon weakness, and the president ought to toughen up this week. You'll notice Kerry said President Obama put sanctions in place before the event happened. Well, it was a minor increase in the sanctions in response to what the Russians were doing in eastern Ukraine. For us now to have this unspeakable act, as the administration called it, passed without tougher sanctions is going to be really problematic.
So you lay out a pattern here of, I don't know if you'd call it delay or indecision, or perhaps you call it both.
I call it weakness and fecklessness.
Okay, if you believe that, then what do you believe President Obama will do this week?
You know what? Probably not much. I mean, this amazes me. He had a 5-minute statement about Ukraine. His first statement was 40 seconds at a public speech. Then he gave a 5-minute statement in the Situation Room. If you want to be symbolic, go give an address about this. Go to the Netherlands embassy and sign the book of remembrance and grief, and stand with the Netherlands ambassador and talk about how the West must not let this stand. You know, even on the symbolism he's weak, let alone on the substance, and the substance matters here. Tough sanctions and aid the Ukrainians in visible ways that help them reestablish control. That would be tough. Okay. But so far we got weakness.
Lindsey Graham was on Meet the Press. You know, Secretary Kerry did all 5 Sunday talk shows. They did the full Ginsburg, as we call it now. This is Lindsey Graham reacting to a comment from Secretary Kerry about how the world is a more stable place. Watch.
He gave the most ridiculous and delusional summary of American foreign policy I could imagine. It scares me that he believes the world is in such good shape. America is the glue that holds the free world together. Leading from behind is not working. The world is adrift, and President Obama has become the king of indecision. His policies are failing across the globe, and they will come here soon.
2 points on that, Carl. If We don't lead. The history shows us Europe does not. They're waiting for us. And the king of indecision phrase that Graham is referring to in that soundbite there, if you believe that, again, then what is the expectation or anticipation on behalf of Vladimir Putin that anyone will get him to do anything because of this?
Look, there have there been costs to Putin on the international scene in public from a public opinion perspective. That is to say, the world now sees him as a bad actor in the region. But think about this: he's got the Crimea with relatively little cost to him. He's got instability in Ukraine, which weakens that country and makes them more likely not to fall into the Western orbit. So far, he has not had a very high cost to his actions. And as I say, he has thought deeply about how to reestablish the Russian empire and its influence, and he's looking for weakness and seizing upon that weakness whenever he can.
But if
you think showing strength.
Yeah. He stuck us in the eye on Iran and also on Syria, but now you've got him. You've got the evidence. In 5 seconds left, I mean, this is the one where you can squeeze him because the world is behind you.
Tough sanctions. Absolutely. Tough sanctions and give the Ukrainians what they need in order to reestablish control against the Russian separatists in the east. And we will take a big step putting Putin back in the box.
All right, I've got to run. Carl, thanks. Talk again later in the week. Carl Rove, live in Austin, Texas. Thank you.